I'm Jane Harman, the president and CEO of the Wilson Center and a former 9-term member of the House and a former chief counsel and staff director of 2 Senate Judiciary subcommittees. It is wonderful to see colleagues and friends from both chambers and to welcome our board, led by Ambassador Joe Gildenhorn, our chairman, key supporters and staff of the Wilson Center to a very special event. Let me also note that today was the funeral of a friend and former colleague, Senator Frank Lautenberg, the last surviving World War II veteran in the Senate. It matters that we remember and honor the service of people like Frank and people like Woodrow Wilson. Did you know that when President-elect Wilson arrived in Washington, he was shocked that the streets were nearly empty as he drove to his hotel? He remarked, "Where are all the people?" Well, 8,000 women were on Pennsylvania Avenue completing a march in the suffrage parade. Tens of thousands more, including parents and children, were out to observe the protest for the right of women to vote. Though his wife and daughters were split on the issue, in his second term, Wilson made an appeal to Congress to support the 19th Amendment, even calling a special session to pass it late in his presidency. And 100 years later, this is precisely 100 years later from his inauguration, there are 20 senators and 81 members of the House who just happen to be women. I was elected in 1992, one of those so-called years of the women. Thank you, President Wilson. Wilson was our only PhD president, and he wrote his thesis on Congress. He said, unquestionably, the predominant and controlling force, the center and source of all motive, of all regulative power, is Congress. So people ask me if I miss Congress. Of course I do. It was an honor to serve here for 17 years, but the one thing about my new gig that I couldn't get here is the absence of partisanship. The Center is a global brain trust, a worldwide network of scholars, policymakers, business and civic leaders that generates actionable ideas and prepares the next generation of global leaders for policy challenges ahead. Woodrow Wilson would approve of us. He admonished that we are not put into this world to sit still and know, we are put on it to act. World leaders like former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, Egyptian General Mohammed El-Assar, Canada Prime Minister Stephen Harper, IMF Director Christine Lagarde, and the presidents of Yemen, Kosovo, Mexico, Honduras, Malawi, Brazil, Burundi have chosen to speak at the Wilson Center in the past year. One of our newest initiatives, and this is my last comment, is our Foreign Policy Fellowship Program. 50 Hill staff have been coming to the Wilson Center on Fridays to learn from policy experts like Tom Friedman, Steve Hadley, and Bob Kagan about key foreign policy issues. But the best part comes when they break into smaller groups on a random, bipartisan, bicameral basis to present their collective views on various topics. A few weeks ago, they actually role-played bilateral meetings with Putin, Ahmadinejad, and Assad. And my hope is that they will use the information and relationships from these sessions to inform their bosses, some of whom are here, and to develop new oversight and legislative strategies together. Let's give a shout out to those from your staffs who come down to Wilson and are going to form a cadre, I hope, of well-informed and bipartisan unity on foreign policy. So, in conclusion, at a cabinet meeting early in his presidency, a cabinet member commended President Wilson on his short speeches and asked him how much time it took him to prepare. Wilson replied, "It depends. If I am to speak for 10 minutes, I need a week for preparation. If 15 minutes, 3 days. If half an hour, 2 days. If an hour, I'm ready right now." No doubt today's speakers have each spent a week in preparation, and it's my pleasure to recognize our hosts, the leaders of Congress, and then the author of a stunning new biography of Wilson, 2 members from New Jersey with expertise on President Wilson, and a legend, the current Librarian of Congress, who spent over a decade leading the Wilson Center and developing the centerpiece of our work, which is our program for scholars. Thank you very much, and I know that the first speaker is the Honorable Mitch McConnell.
Well, thank you very much, Jane. Appropriately enough, I just happened to be talking to Doris Kearns Goodwin a while ago, and some of you may know her new book that'll be out this fall is about the relationship between Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. And obviously, all you Wilson junkies know that their falling out had a good deal to do with the launch of Woodrow Wilson in 1912. Jane, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here today. We certainly miss your expertise around Capitol, but you certainly managed to remain in the center of the debates. I also want to thank Joe Gildenhorn for your leadership and your stewardship. Joe, thank you. As Jane indicated, we're here today to mark the 100th anniversary of the Woodrow Wilson presidency, and much has changed since he took office. The invention of the television, the personal computer, the mobile phone, the iPad, stunning advances in medicine, entertainment, defense, the official discovery and undiscovery of a planet, and radically different standards of living that could hardly have been imagined back in 1913. If President Wilson could have looked ahead, I'm sure he'd have been quite astonished to see the ways we live and work today, probably pleasantly so. And international developments might have intrigued him even more than that. After all, in 1913, there were few true democracies like our own. Liberal democracy was just starting to put down firmer roots across the European continent. Administrators from many of those same states imposed imperial rule over millions in Africa and the Indian subcontinent. And swaths of the Middle East lived under a neglectful government in Istanbul. Wilson, I think, would see the development of democratic institutions over the past century as one of the most positive historical developments since his day. And I think he would see it as one of the most closely tied to his legacy. This was, after all, the man who characterized America's entry into World War I as a crusade to make the world safe for democracy. Of course, dying in 1924, he never lived to see if his crusade had had the desired effect. And in the short term, it didn't. The world soon spiraled into yet another horrific global conflict with untold death and destruction. The Soviet Union fought to spread communism and created a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and the Third World. Military strongmen booted out civilian governments in capitals around the globe. To many, it may have seemed as if democracy would only ever belong to a fortunate few here in the West. But history rarely travels in a straight line, and today things are indeed much different. Nearly all of Europe, parts of Africa, and much of Latin America and Asia have embraced democratic institutions. And I think Wilson would be pleased to see that some of the ideas embodied in his 14 points have become accepted norms in the 21st century, things like freedom of the seas and free trade. And once improbable developments like the rise of a free and democratic and secure Poland are remarkable today only insofar as how unattainable they seemed back in 1913. So you don't have to agree with a man on everything to share his devotion to a particular cause. In Wilson's case, most conservatives, including myself, have a long-standing quarrel with a view he famously expressed in 1913 that the Constitution spoke more powerfully to those of a bygone era than it does to modernity. It's an important difference that lies at the heart of many of today's pressing debates. But we're not going to resolve that argument this evening, so I'll stick to where we agree. And indeed, on the issue of securing a more democratic Burma, for instance, or of supporting democracies in Central and Eastern Europe as they seek to defend themselves against aggressive neighbors, or of providing moral support to those suffering under the thumb of dictators from Minsk to Pyongyang, I think Wilson would largely be there with us small d Democrats. He'd be proud of how far the world has come since he swore the oath of office, and he'd look, I think, with optimism at a future he helped to shape. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me say welcome to the Wilson Center and welcome to the United States Capitol and welcome to our former chamber, the Hall of the House, where Congress for the first 56 years here in Washington did their business, right here in this room. I want to say thanks to Jane and all the work that the Wilson Center does and all of those that support the Wilson Center. It's a fabulous institution that I think helps all of us do our jobs a lot better. You know, when they asked me to say a few words tonight about Wilson, one of the first things that came to mind was that he was the one who brought back the tradition of delivering the State of the Union in person. And that's exactly, I think, how it should be. The President of the United States speaking directly to the people's representatives. Even if it means the American people have to sit there and watch me try to sit still for an hour, next to Joe Biden, no less. You know, tonight we're not just celebrating Woodrow Wilson as president, we're honoring him as a student of the Congress as well. Mitch talked about his devotion to democratic principles and what he brought, I think, to our country and to the rest of the world. But just about every member of the House and Senate has at some time referenced his quote about how the real work of Congress occurs in our committees. Now, that line was actually part of a criticism. He was talking about how some committees were powerful little legislatures that handled most of the business, and some of the committees were pretty weak. It was a valuable warning. And there certainly have been times when committees have either been too powerful or had too much power, and other times when they've been too weak. That's why restoring the legislative process has been one of my top priorities as Speaker. So I think if Wilson went from committee room to committee room today, he'd see more balance and he'd see more activity. He'd see that committees have all their bills, votes, and hearings available on the internet. He'd see more amendments, and I think he would see more collaboration. And when bills get to the floor, he'd see more debate and a more open process. And I think he'd see better legislators and better legislation. Now, these aren't the most glamorous reforms, and frankly, it'll take time for all of this to work. But just like with President Wilson, bringing back that old custom, this is about governing as our founding fathers would have us govern. It's about demonstrating, as Wilson said, the diligence, good temper, and full comprehension of public duty that he called for in that first State of the Union. Congratulations on all of your accomplishments. Congratulations to Woodrow Wilson and all that he gave us over the last 100 years. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It is an honor to be here with all of you to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the inauguration of President Woodrow Wilson, and to thank our colleague, Congresswoman Jane Harman, President of the Wilson Center, for her leadership and her invitation to be here this evening. It's my privilege to join our distinguished speaker and the leader, Leader McConnell, coming over from the Senate, and my colleagues Rush Holt and Leonard Lance. I suppose they share a representation of Princeton or thereabouts, and we know how important that all was to President Woodrow Wilson and to this center, and to be with Scott Berg, the author of Wilson, soon to be published. That's pretty exciting. I want to thank Joe Gildenhorn for his leadership. Thank you and your family for your support and chairmanship of the Wilson Center. So 100 years ago, Wilson took the oath of office, and while Jane was speaking earlier about how long he responded, takes longer to write a shorter speech, I was recalling that in my teenage years, as I was reading J.D. Salinger in one of his books, he says at the end, if I had more time, I would have written you a shorter letter. So in keeping with that, I also remember, though that was in English class, in history class, at the time we were learning about Woodrow Wilson, and that Halloween, you only reminded me of, in your speeches of this. It came to me that in my teenage years, I once went to a Halloween party dressed as Wilson's 14 Points, but nobody, but it was a white sheet and it had hangers and they all pointed out, and nobody could guess what I was, and I thought it was so obvious. Anyway, I'm going to try it again. But anyway, some of us will be repeating what has been said before. That's what happens when you are third, but some of it bears repeating. 100 years ago, upon taking the oath of office, President Wilson spoke of our nation's efforts to rectify wrong, alleviate suffering, and set the weak in a way of strength and hope. How beautiful, how timeless. On that mild March day, he would add, justice and only justice shall be our motto. President Wilson spoke those words standing just outside these walls at the east portico of the Capitol. That's when they used to have the inauguration on the east side. Yet members of Congress should all take pride in the words he spoke and the actions he inspired within the walls of the Capitol to realize his vision, to rectify wrong and suffering, strengthen the weak, and advance his motto of justice. Indeed, President Wilson stood before Congress, as the Speaker indicated, as the first president to speak before a joint session and the first to deliver a report of the State of the Union in person since President John Adams. Do I have it right, Mr. Librarian of Congress? Is that correct? It's okay? It's okay, all right. He stood before Congress to usher our nation into the First World War and to declare that the world must be made safe for democracy. He stood before Congress on September 30th, 1918, in a moment long overdue to express his support for a woman's right to vote and a woman's right to be heard. Long overdue. Actually, at the time of the passing of the amendment to the Constitution, when it passed, the next day the headlines read, "Women given the right to vote." Now, you know, it wasn't quite that way. Women fought for it, and as Jane indicated, thousands of them were there when President Wilson came to Washington. And he came before Congress as an internationalist president in an isolationist age to announce his famous 14 points and to promise an agenda of a strong American role in international institutions, strong American partnerships with our allies, strong American leadership for peace across the globe. He was a different kind of president. As has been mentioned, he was the only PhD to serve in the office. He was a scholar and a statesman. On this, today, his legacy lives on in the work of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, our nation's living memorial to our 28th president. With the leadership of Chairman Joseph Gildenhorn, again, Joe, past President Lee Hamilton, and current President Jane Harman, the Wilson Center brings together the best features of the Wilson presidency, uniting academic experts with policymakers, as Jane indicated, connecting research and policy, informing our politics with substance, and our diplomacy with scholarship. That was the spirit Jane Harman brought to this House every day that she served here. She was and remains an authoritative voice on national security and foreign affairs. It's just a perfect match. Congresswoman Jane Harman, president of the Woodrow Wilson Center. She was and remains an advocate for the principles cherished and advanced by Woodrow Wilson. On this centennial of his inauguration, President Wilson still stands today in our memories and in our history as a leader of principle, as a proponent of democracy, as a champion of peace. At home and abroad, from the first moment of his presidency to the last, he always strived to live up to his motto of justice. When I was reading about his motto, I was reminded of Pope Paul VI, who came much later as a pope, and he said, if you want peace, work for justice. How similar their thinking was. May our country and our leaders long be inspired by President Wilson's memory and his example and his leadership. May we continue to benefit from the knowledge and leadership of the Woodrow Wilson Center. Thank you all. Thank you.
Hi, if you look down the roster of speakers, you'll see that I am the only one who is not the honorable. An irony, I think. And while Jim Billington is one of the great scholars in this country, now why are you an honorable, though? Okay, all right. I'm not complaining, I'm just wondering. Anyway, it is extremely appropriate that we are under the great dome this evening because no sitting president of the United States spent as much time in the Capitol as Woodrow Wilson did. And there was a very good reason for it, actually, which is Woodrow Wilson, in fact, did not really want to be president of the United States. He really wanted to be Prime Minister of the United States. And if you go through any of his readings, any of his writings, he was steeped in the English parliamentary system. His heroes were Gladstone and John Bright and Burke, along with Daniel Webster and George Washington, all the great Americans. But it was really those English parliamentarians that turned him on to government. And he really wanted to run a parliament more than anything else. And if you look at the way he was president, the way he served, you'll see that every now and then he was trying to make little adjustments in our system so that it resembled the parliament a little more. His fear, you see, in our system of government was that if you had one party running, say, the Congress and another party, say, the White House, that there might be gridlock or something like that, and that everyone couldn't get along, and this was going to be a problem, and we wouldn't have any legislation. It would be quite terrible. There might be hostility, there might be tension. Whatever the result, the one thing we know as we who have been on Jane's caravan all day, the one thing we know is that Woodrow Wilson believed in rule by rhetoric. That was his sharpest tool. He believed in its power. And he believed that with oratory based on passion and informed judgments and real strong beliefs, you could change people's hearts and minds, not only within the legislature, but across the country. So be it. So whatever system we had, whatever system he got stuck with, and he made it work, his trump card was oratory. Now, the result of that was, more than any other president that I know of, Woodrow Wilson engaged in sustained dialogue. There was a constant conversation between the White House and the legislature, and the people of the United States. He did that. The Speaker referred to the fact that Wilson was the first to bring back that tradition of delivering the State of the Union address, and that is true. Nobody had done that since John Adams, and it is a most welcome tradition. Wilson did it again to spark the dialogue. But he not only had that first great joint session of Congress, Wilson came back 24 times Every time he had an important piece of legislation, Woodrow Wilson would call Congress into session, both houses. He would come in here, he would make his case. And as if that was not enough, and it wasn't enough for him, there is a room in this great building called the President's Room. It was a concept of George Washington. He had an idea that there should be one room in this great edifice, and it is, in fact, the most beautiful little gem of a room in this whole building, a room where the President of the United States could come at any time and do his business with the Congress. And Wilson, whenever he had an important piece of legislation he wanted passed, would come to that room. And he would sit there, and he would have an open door. There was a desk there. Sometimes he was here 3 or 4 times a week, conducting the business of America from the President's room within the Capitol building. It was extremely effective. We know how progressive that first agenda was in his first term. But largely it was because of what that President's room became, which is the way he used it, not just literally, but metaphorically. And that is that above all else, especially based on what we heard about his early writings when he was in college about the power and importance of Congress, Wilson believed in cooperation in government. And I want to rephrase that, actually. He believed more literally in the cooperation of government. He believed that legislation was passed because the two branches, the executive and the legislative, were cooperating, they were working together. Because I am the only dishonorable speaker today, I'm going to exhort any legislators or friends of legislators who are still in the room just to say, I hope you will bear in mind the Woodrow Wilson example, this need to cooperate all the time. And I'm not just talking about different parties, I'm not talking about different branches here, different houses of the Congress. Pennsylvania Avenue, last time I looked, was a two-way street. And it seems to me the President might want to pay a visit to his room, which is sitting here, waiting. And I think the more sustained dialogue we have, well, you know, the public is just getting tired of what we're not seeing. And, well, and so I urge everyone in the government, cooperate. Thank you very much.
Good evening. I'm Leonard Lance. I represent a district in New Jersey. My colleague, Congressman Holt, may have been delayed because of the funeral today of our senior United States Senator, Senator Lautenberg. But I respectfully suggest that if President Wilson were alive, he would mourn the loss of Senator Lautenberg, who served the state of New Jersey with great distinction. I'm grateful to Congresswoman Harman for permitting me to speak this evening, and I thank her and the Center for all that you do on behalf of the nation. In his inaugural address, delivered, as Speaker Pelosi has said, at the east front of the Capitol 100 years ago, Woodrow Wilson asked the question whether we have the pure heart to comprehend and the rectified will to choose our high course of action. A high course of action was always Woodrow Wilson's goal, first in the university setting at Princeton, then at New Jersey's State House in Trenton, then summoning the nation as a whole here in Washington and across this broad land, and finally arousing the moral conscience of the world at Versailles. At its sesquicentennial in 1896, the College of New Jersey became Princeton University. In the best remembered address at that occasion, the 39-year-old Wilson, then Princeton's most popular professor, said, "It is not learning but the spirit of service that will give a college place in the public annals of the nation. We dare not keep aloof and closet ourselves while a nation comes to its maturity. The spirit of service in an inclusionary campus was Wilson's goal throughout his tenure as professor, and from 1902 forward as university president. Moving to the governorship in 1911, he fought to include the people of New Jersey in the affairs of our state. Thus, his tremendous legislative success in enacting a primary election law, a Corruption Practices Act, workers' compensation, and a strong Public Utilities Commission. The great presidential election of 1912, with Wilson, Theodore Roosevelt, and William Howard Taft as contenders, stands as a hallmark of reasoned debate in presidential history. And once elected, Wilson did pursue a high course of action with enactment of the new freedom: the Underwood Tariff, the Federal Reserve System, the Clayton Antitrust Act, and the Adamson Act creating the 8-hour workday. The colleagues he brought into government were among the most noted of any administration: William Jennings Bryan and Robert Lansing, William Gibbs McAdoo and Carter Glass, Newton D. Baker and John W. Davis, Colonel House and Herbert Hoover, Louis Brandeis, and the young Franklin Roosevelt. But all of this was prelude to Wilson as leader in the World War and architect of the world peace. His dreams were articulated in the 14 points, among which open covenants openly arrived at, freedom of the seas, formation of a League of Nations. And while it took a generation and an even more deadly war for America to show the way, indeed we have. Woodrow Wilson's legacy is at the center of our beliefs as a mature nation that all of the peoples of the world deserve to breathe free, to fulfill their destinies, and to live in peace. As we commemorate the 100th anniversary of the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson as president, let us rededicate ourselves to these principles and to Woodrow Wilson's hope, as expressed in that first inaugural address, to have the pure heart to comprehend and the rectified will to choose our high course of action. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Distinguished members and leaders of Congress, Chairman Gildenhorn, its leader, Jane Harman, and distinguished guests and students of Woodrow Wilson, friends of the Wilson Center, it's really an honor to be speaking about this remarkable president, the third American ever to receive a PhD, the only lead president who was president of the university, governor of a state, and then not only president of the United States, but one of the first who reached the world, fired the world's imagination in places it had not been stimulated before, and of course, left a remarkable legacy as the last president who did not have the aid of the mass media, not even radio, came in time for his words to be heard as widely as they could, and yet somehow they resonated throughout the world. Anyhow, it took a half century from the time Woodrow Wilson was awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace until the nation finally decided how to memorialize him. There were then and remain today as many activities bearing the name of Woodrow Wilson, our 28th president, as there are varied assessments of his presidency. But not until October 1970, exactly a half-century later, did a totally new kind of living presidential memorial come into being, when the first group of 25 fellows arrived at the Smithsonian Castle to begin the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. It had been created by the Congress, signed into existence by President Lyndon Johnson, warmly endorsed by the president who succeeded him, Richard Nixon, and set up under a board headed by Johnson's Vice President Hubert Humphrey, who once told me that this was the only request he made of Johnson when he left office together with his president. Interesting, because he told how this was really his boyhood idol, and how he voluntarily, as so many have done, took up a new form of public service as his legacy. Now, the basic nature of this new center was prefigured in the suggestion that Woodrow Wilson himself made while he was still in office in 1922 to a future president, Franklin Roosevelt, who had just been named chairman of the first national body raising funds to memorialize President Wilson, whom Roosevelt had served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Wilson wanted the money raised for the Wilson Fund to reward whoever, and this is a direct quote, has made the most practical contributions to the liberal thought of the world with regard to human rights or international relationships. Now, that's one of the first major usage, as far as I can tell, of human rights as a particular characterization of what the world and the international relationships had to be based on. Of course, it's implicit on having a Bill of Rights at the beginning of our existence, but it is also prophetic of the role that this now plays in every serious discussion of nations. Hubert Humphrey, the founding chairman of this new center for bringing together the worlds of affairs and of ideas, appointed an experienced public servant, Ben Reid, as its first director. He wrote its initial blueprint suggesting a balance between scholars and practitioners. They were to work on big questions of public concern, mostly in groups, and relying largely on what he called, and I quote him again, the social and behavioral sciences. I was fortunate to succeed him in 1973 as director for 14 years, and largely forming the center into regions of the world and adding into the mix of fellows and major humanistic scholars who at that time rarely ever came to Washington. Latin American novelists like Carlos Fuentes and Mario Vargas Llosa, great historians who'd rarely been to America like Fernando Brodel, and people who, like Wilson himself, bridged scholarship with high-level public service. General Andrew Goodpaster, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, Foreign Minister of Poland Bronisław Geremek, and Ambassador George Kennan. Now, in the quarter century since I left the center, the distinguished chairman, Gildenhorn, board members, and directors of the center have all added a permanent and more capacious home for this unique memorial, have filled it with a great variety of skilled and dedicated staff, fellows, and public programs of a kind that Jane Harman only modestly described at the beginning of this gathering, and I'm sure has been evident to everyone in this room. And I certainly continue to admire all they are doing to stimulate and expand the interaction of affairs and ideas for the mutual benefit of both and for the country that we all serve. I was fortunate to serve as director under two remarkable board chairmen, Bill Baruti and Max Kampelman, and a vice chairman, Pat Moynihan, who had long been a leading activist in promoting a memorial of this kind precisely for President Wilson. I'd like to pay special tribute to some of the early builders, my then Deputy Prosser Gifford, who established a high standard of scholarly quality for all Wilson Center activities, and to three other colleagues who in those early days forged parts of this ever-growing and remarkable center that still flourish today. Peter Braystrup, who founded the Wilson Quarterly, Fred Starr, who energetically ran the Kennan Institute, and David Packard Sr., the co-founder of Hewlett-Packard, who was the founding chairman of the Wilson Council. But finally, and by no means least, I want to conclude by thanking and congratulating the two most recent directors, Representatives Hamilton and Harman, each of whom came directly to the center from long and widely respected service as leading members of Congress with broad international experience of precisely the kind that Wilson himself had envisaged. And let me, on behalf of us all, thank especially, first of all, Chairman Joe Gildenhorn, who's long served important leadership, but above all, especially Jane Harman, the center's first female director, whose skill and energy has put together this inspiring and inspirational commemoration. I just might mention that the very first group that came together to memorialize Wilson was three women in New York who created the initial foundation, which slowly evolved, combined with other ideas, into the great center that has convened this really important, wonderful, living tribute to the living memorial. So with admiration and appreciation to her and her fine staff who have made this all possible, I'm happy to turn the proceedings over to the person to whom it belongs, our present director taking us into the 21st century, Jane Harman.
So this concludes our program. My thanks to all of our speakers and my acknowledgement, and Jim Billington mentioned this too, to the extraordinary staff of the Wilson Center, many of whom are here, and particularly to one person who reached for me when I came, who worked for Lee Hamilton for 30 years, many of those at the Wilson Center, a Princeton graduate, Mike Van Dusen. Thank you to all of you. And again, thank you, Woodrow, for 100 years of an international policy that, at its best, honors our country and honors our world.